name is Bryce and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Jacko Trades. It's been a really long time since I've been in front of this camera, going on about 16 months, but that's a story for another day. Today we are going to do a deep dive on my 2026 Poor Boys RC Speedrun Contender. This is my Tamiya Frog ORV chassis that I'm running in the Speedrun Challenge. I've had a lot of success with it in the last 2 days that I've been running it, so I thought I'd go ahead and share everything that I put into the build. I basically spent the entire month of June designing it, and then around the last week of June I actually started building it, and then I ran it for the first time on July 4th, which was yesterday, and then I ran it today, which is July 5th. I'm having such good results with it that I figured I'd just go ahead and share what I've done on the build. It's been a long time since I've done a technical video, but I put a lot of thought into the car, a lot of time into it, and I kind of want to go through my thought process and some of the decisions I've made on the car, and why I did what I did, and maybe some of this information will be useful or helpful to those of you that are trying to make a Tamiya Frog go fast and be reliable. It's not just about building a fast car, it's building a fast car that will survive a crash or just survive a run doing 100 miles an hour without falling apart. So a lot of what I've done is based on personal experiences with speedrun cars over the years, and also leveraging what other people have done with their cars. There is kind of an advantage of sitting back in the shadows and watching people struggle and learning from their challenges that I have been able to implement into my vehicles. For example, the stretching of the chassis, I did that last year with the Grasshopper. This is kind of torn apart from a crash last time I ran it. I think it was Guru's World that had stretched his chassis out in the back, and I kind of saw that and it looked like a really good idea, so I implemented it in this guy. And I've done it the same with this car here, where I actually went ahead and stretched the chassis by about 4 inches, as you can see here. Actually, it's hard to see. So there's a stock car, and then there's the extended car. This video has the potential to be quite long. I don't know how long I'll cut it off at. It could be anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes long. So get yourself a bag of popcorn and strap in and enjoy the ride. I do appreciate you tuning in, so thank you for doing that. And go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button when you get a chance. I am a maker, tinker, creator. I can't leave well enough alone. I've always been that way. So this is kind of, if you know me and you know what I've done, you know that I make things like this. And they usually, you know, I don't necessarily do things just for looks. I try to do it functionally. So where I lack an experience with driving RC cars, you know, so I try to bring to the table my engineering background, and applying that kind of from a first order perspective in what I would do with a greenfield design. And when it comes to these speedrun challenge cars, I try to maintain the spirit of the vehicle and not butcher it too bad. For example, the rear half of this vehicle is completely bolt-on. I could take this as a modular pod and hand it to anyone out there with an ORV chassis, and they could bolt it up. When we get into the front end stuff, there's not a lot of options for bolting things on, so you know, a lot of these reinforcement plates you have to basically line them up, and you drill new holes into the plastic frame and screw it down. And they're actually not too hard to implement, but it's not 100% bolt-on. There is some drilling new holes and screwing things together. And the only hacking that I've really done on this is, I'm trying to remember. The only thing I cut on this car, on this chassis, were these there's these little plastic tabs here that give you some real estate for, I think, your radio gear in the original chassis. And I cut that out because my battery sits right along the center axis of the vehicle. And by cutting that out, I was able to drop in a pretty large 3S pack into the vehicle. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the camera around. And we'll do a deeper dive into this build. Depending on how deep I decide to go, I might take off some parts so we can show off some of the features that were designed into it. Alright, so without further ado, we'll go on and move to the other bench and flip the camera around and dig into it. Thanks for tuning in and watching. Okay, so there's a couple things I want to mention before we get going. First, I'd like you to check out and be in awe of my new RC work mat for my bench. I just picked this up this year using my... last year I won a gift certificate to Cal RC for winning the Poi Boys RC Speedrun Challenge Open Class. So I used that to buy a new work mat. And this thing is freaking awesome. First of all, it's a big mat. It's 30 inches by 24 inches. And I'm not sponsored by Cal RC, but they have some really cool products. So I think it's a PVC material. And then it has a silicone. This is supposed to be a solder mat. But I like it just because it gives contrast for what you're working on versus having a black background. And then it's got these little pockets on the side for parts trays, and these come out. These are just 3D printed, so you can make your own if you want to. The corner ones have magnets to hold screws, but it's the best work mat that I've had, and I've used a lot of different work mats. So kudos to Cal RC for coming out with a great product. I really do like this work mat. So we all know a typical ORV chassis. It's fairly short, squat. It's got interesting suspension, interesting drivetrain. Lay down shocks in the rear. There's internal shocks, at least for the Frog. There's internal springs up on the front with a little lever arm that pushes on a little button on those springs. So there's basically there's no damping in the front. It's just a spring. And then the center, or the servo, is typically biased in one direction. This is my son's entry into the brushless class this year for the Poi Boys RC Speedrun Challenge. This is his car that he's been building on his own. I have not helped him except just to give him kind of guidance along the way, but he's been doing this all on his own. Then I've been throwing hop-up parts to him. A lot of what I'm doing here is leverage on what I did with the Grasshopper last year. So one of the more notable things is the extended chassis. The front wing, which I found to help quite a bit. I run a fairly large rear wing on these vehicles. This is actually from a 5th scale HPI Baja 5B, but it's kind of a interesting addition that seems to work, though it probably does add some drag, or if not a lot of drag, to the vehicle, but it keeps things planted. What I found in the Grasshopper was that my front end was actually coming up when I got fast enough, so I put a front wing on the Grasshopper, and then this year I integrated that wing into the original design. One of the things I wanted to do was try out one of these TP power motors, and I wanted to put a big motor in here, as big as I could get, or as big as I had on hand. But the motor would not fit with the typical mount off to the side. It would hit the wheels, and I didn't want to extend the track width of this vehicle because I was kind of limiting myself to the original suspension, or the original geometry of the suspension arms. And if you do that, then your track width is not very wide. And sure, you could put huge axle extenders on, but they're putting a lot of stresses on your drive shafts and your suspension, and you just run the risk of things kind of breaking during your runs, and I didn't want to do that. So I thought I'd stick with my kind of stock track width of the vehicle. And actually we can see on my son's car, he's got 12 millimeter adapters, and he's got 12 to 17 millimeter adapters stacked on top of that. So he's got like a pretty wide track width, wider than my car, but he's got so much axle sticking out from the trailing arm that this is not a very strong setup, and I'm actually going to work with him to... I have some shorter 12 millimeter adapters to narrow this up by probably about the same width as my car. But you can kind of see how I can just sit here and flex those plastic arms. And that's just, you know, your arms are under stress, the drive shafts are under stress, which people are already breaking those. So this is not a good setup to go with, and I didn't want to do that with my car. I wanted to, again, my primary focus was reliability or robustness and going fast. So I had to pull that motor out, and I was able to center it, and we basically did more of a traditional two-wheel drive buggy motor setup that you'd see from the 90s, and very similar to like a stealth transmission from an RC10. Where you've got 3 gears inside, and you got your spur gear outside and then pinion. And the other benefit of this is it allows me to play around and easily swap out pinion gears. You know, I can come in and swap out a pinion gear in like 5 minutes, and I don't have to... I guess you could do that on the normal ORV, but you are limited in pinion gear size with the ORV gearbox. Here right now I'm running a 33 tooth pinion. I could probably step it up to a 40 if I wanted to. And I also have options to play around with my spur gear. It's easy to swap out different spur gear sizes if needed. So going through, a tour of the vehicle, the suspension is kind of conventional. You've got your trailing arms and you have the little bell crank that's mounted to the trailing arm that compresses your lay-down shocks. By extending the chassis 4 inches, that also gave me more real estate, and that's where I stuffed my Mama Monster X8S speed controller, basically in between that little pocket there between the original chassis and the ORV gearbox. So I focused on the rear end. Then once I was done with that design, it was kind of in the middle of fabrication. I then started looking at the front end. So once I shifted my effort to the front end, I had to start thinking about my battery. And originally I was going to actually run a smaller battery because it's pretty tight in here. But I started playing around with this Onyx 6600 milliamp hour battery, which is kind of a conventional battery length, but it's fat. And I was able to make it work where I could squeeze it in here and still stuff my servo. I rotated my servo 90 degrees and shoved that as far forward as I could, where you can actually see kind of the angle of my turnbuckles or steering linkages are swept backwards because I'm so far forward. And I'm also running a fairly short servo arm to clear the front shock towers, or not shock towers, but the internal, I don't even know what those are called, the internal uprights. So yeah, we got the battery situated, then we got our servo situated, and then I basically, I think from day one, I was dead set on running stock geometry suspension, which is what we see here, but I did want to run some actual shocks with the shock tower, which is what I have set up. And then I wanted that front wing in the front to keep the front end down. And then the last thing I had to think about was radio gear and body mounting. So I came up with this body mount to integrate with the original Frog body, where I've got one hole in the front, which is typical, and the 2 holes for mounting the wing, which I'm using to mount my body. Originally I was thinking about having my battery cables come out the side, which is why I have this notch cut out. And I was going to plug in to the ESC from the side here. I didn't like that because I don't like having my battery cables exposed in a crash. So I figured out a way to kind of stuff those in there. It's not a very good fit, but it works. And anywho, I kind of digressed there. I got 3 points for mounting the body, and it works pretty clever. It's easy to take the body on and off. I guess backing up a little bit, when Phil first announced the ORV chassis, I immediately knew I would do the Grasshopper build. My philosophy on aerodynamics, it absolutely matters when you're going this fast. However, so in aerodynamics, and I'm not an aerospace engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer, but I have worked with people and I've done projects that were very aerodynamic dependent, including soapbox racing. When you're talking about aerodynamics, one of the critical variables or features is your frontal area of the vehicle. You want to minimize that as much as possible to reduce drag. So it's not just the shape of the vehicle, it's also the size of that shape, which I think makes sense. What I found on the TT02 runs is that the more quote-unquote aerodynamic bodies weren't necessarily the best bodies because the frontal area would increase and you would have more resistance or more air that you would have to push through. I actually did some qualitative testing where I think I was out one day and I had 4 or 5 different bodies and I just was swapping them and getting, being able to verify what bodies were the fastest to run at the time. This is kind of a long story, but going back to the chassis announcement and my experience with the Grasshopper, where it's a very small frontal area. It's as small as you can get, right? Where most of the stuff that sticks out is your chassis. I went with the Grasshopper because it's the smallest body. So that's a long story short. Grasshopper body because it's small frontal area, and I don't care about the rest of the stuff. I had good experience with the Grasshopper going 111 miles an hour, and so I'm confident that with this vehicle, I can probably get up to 110, 111 at least. I've posted photos, and maybe I'll post some more photos in this video of my custom gearbox. Basically, I'm using the original ORV box, and I did my own gear layout inside. I wanted to go all metal gears because I basically wanted to be able to put as much power through this drivetrain as possible without worrying about stripping gears. However, I would have preferred to use a gear diff, but it's really difficult to do an all-metal gear diff. I guess I could have found one and integrated it into the design, but I didn't want to mess with that, and I had the MIP ball diff, so what I did was I machined a metal gear to integrate with the existing MIP ball diff. So we see the MIP out drives here. Then originally I was actually running the Tamiya, not the Tamiya, what's the other brand? X Speed, I think. I was running their CVDs. I ended up breaking those both sides in different runs just from the torque, because there's not a lot of meat. If you look at the end of the CVD where the joint is, there's not a lot of meat that's taking the torque of that drivetrain. And so I kind of decided to try out these dog bones. These are the original frog dog bones, and they worked for me. No breakage today when I did my runs. Let's go into the deeper dive and also kind of talk about some of my build capabilities. So in my shop, I have the ability to 3D print. I can do CNC machining, manual machining. I can turn parts on a lathe, and I have a CNC router which I can cut out carbon fiber parts. So I love carbon fiber. The material is not too expensive, and I can cut it out all day long, which is why we see a lot of carbon fiber on this car. It's a great material. It's strong. It's very stiff. It's a really cool material. It looks great. So there's a lot of carbon fiber parts, and then I use 3D printed parts to kind of tie those parts together. That's why there's so many screws, because basically I have a carbon fiber panel that's bolted or screwed to a 3D printed brace, and then that brace allows you to join carbon fiber parts from various orientations and tie it all together. This car is very stiff. The chassis is very, I mean, this is a quote-unquote bomb-proof car. It will survive a 100-mile-an-hour crash with minimal damage. I think if I did crash at 100 miles an hour, I'd probably end up breaking like a suspension arm or bending one of these aluminum trailing arms. But the carbon fiber holds up pretty well in the 100-mile-an-hour crashes. When I extend chassis and add on, the first thing I need to figure out is how do I tie the extensions or the add-ons into the chassis. And usually I try to touch on as many points as possible. Like in the Grasshopper, you have this little shelf that extends out. I think that's where they mount the shocks originally. But I created all these different 3D printed braces that kind of fit within those cavities, and I was able to tie the extension very well into the bathtub chassis, so that interface is incredibly strong and durable. I did the same thing with the ORV chassis, where I basically took every mounting point and then some and tied it all in to the extension of the chassis. I am going to go ahead and take out, so we're going to start taking the car apart. One of the ways that I'm securing, actually the only way I'm really securing the battery is with this cross post. And in order to get that to work, I basically had to extend this, the battery sits above the plane of the chassis, so I couldn't just put a strap across the top. And I'm not using those cross posts that you would normally see in the build. So what I did was where you put those cross posts in, I put two plates to extend that up, and I have a single cross post to hold the battery down. And the reason I wanted to screw it in versus have like body clips, it helps by screwing this post in, it helps stiffen up the chassis versus just having something loosely attached with body clips. So let's go ahead and take this cross post off so that we can kind of get a better look at the chassis. All right, so there we go. And down in there you can see our GNSS. That was kind of the last design element of this build, where I was trying to figure out where to put that. I was trying to figure out also where to put the receiver. I wanted to tuck it in here, but the routing of the receiver wires was getting, I wanted it simple and I couldn't get it simple. I was going to try and mount the receiver on the bottom side of this top plate, and it was interfering with the shocks, so I just decided to throw it up on top there. Which isn't the best place, but I think in a crash, basically the receiver sits below the high points of the shock tower in that rear wing, so it should be well protected in a crash. The GNS, I didn't want to just Velcro it to the battery door, so I actually designed and printed my own battery door, which I think is a pretty clever design. I maintain these little fins on the bottom, kind of act as a little mini diffuser, but it's more cosmetic than functional. I don't know if it actually works. You can actually see I had a couple runs where my first run or first PB, I lost my tires, so this thing skidded. You can kind of see the low points in the chassis are this plate and then the actual chassis here that we're rubbing on the ground. So I don't normally have to take that battery door off, but if I wanted to, it's basically a single screw, long screw, but okay, that comes out and then this swings out like so. So there it is. And that's again kind of more integration into the original chassis. You can kind of see these posts tie into my mid plates there, and then up above I've got a bunch of other interfaces with those outside plates. So that's where you'd normally have your body post for the Grasshopper body, and I just filled in those gaps to my extended chassis. I run the Radio Link radio gear, and they've got these dual antennas, so I usually try to have some kind of antenna mount. In this case, since I had to make this body mount custom, I decided to go ahead and integrate the antennas into that. So I think that's a pretty trick part. All right, so let's go ahead and take the wheels off and we can look at some of our suspension. I knew from the start that I wanted to run these tires. I've had good luck with these, the Hoons D-Boots tires. I think they're really nice tires. They don't balloon on you, and they hold up well, and they have good traction. And then on the front, so here's another philosophy thing. My philosophy for traction with speedrun cars is on the front, if this is for two-wheel drive too. So we have had years where like the TT02 is four-wheel drive and the MF01X is four-wheel drive. But for the two-wheel drive cars, I have found that you want to run low traction front wheels, and I believe this works because you don't want to have good traction on the front wheels because you don't want a lot of influence from the front wheels on your steering when you're going fast. When you get to a certain speed, actually having these vertical stabilizers helps to keep the car straight. So the steering has less influence, and you want it to have less influence because it's probably the least precision of everything that you have on your car. And your stabilizers, I think, help you go straight. And it's worked for me. So I've got big stabilizers and small tires in the front. On traction on the rear tires for two-wheel drive vehicles, if you have high traction, like these rubbers and the foam tires, what I found is that you want to run some kind of a differential. You don't want to run a locker. The locker will cause problems where as you're going, your car is going to start to do kind of a death wobble where it's kind of bouncing from one to the next. And then it ends up doing this and going out of control and crashing. And I learned this when I was doing the Grasshopper and trying to get straight run passes. I think I hit a wall at like 70 or something. And I just kept crashing because I was running a locker. And I basically put a diff in, and that helped quite a bit. I've also heard from others where if you put your diff too tight, it can cause similar problems. So you do want to have some kind of differential action. Not a lot, but something. And that has kind of proven itself with both this car and the Grasshopper. I know when I was doing the CC01, I ran a locker, and I think I got away with it because I was running those balloon tires, and I would say those balloon tires do not have good traction. That's my philosophy, and it seems to work. Because I knew I wanted to run these wheels, I would need some kind of solution for 17mm adapters. What I did on the Grasshopper was I used, I think, some maybe Tamiya brand, the 12mm adapters. And then I found some kind of short 17mm adapters. But it's kind of a kludgy solution where you have two adapters to get to what you want. And so I kind of immediately decided that I would machine my own custom adapters, which we have here. And then what that allows me to do is precisely control my track width of the vehicle. So in this case, I want the car to be as narrow as possible, but have plenty of clearance between the actual chassis. And so I've got about it's probably about 8mm of clearance between the wheel and the chassis. You also have to keep in mind that when you're going, things move more than you would expect. Things are flexing, they're moving, your tires are moving. So you might have like 2 or 3mm of clearance, but you'll find that you actually rub on things that will start to rub, and I didn't want to have that. However, I was limited by the drive shafts. I didn't look for different types of drive shafts that would work with this, so I was using the frog drive shafts. And what I found was it was a little tricky to get kind of a wheel nut to work, where a lot of the adapters will use a nut to clamp the wheel adapter to the drive shaft, and they have a separate nut for the wheel to the adapter. In this case, I just used one nut to do it all. It clamps the wheel to the adapter and the whole assembly to the drive shaft. And then there's a cross pin, of course, that interfaces with that wheel adapter. So it was both custom adapters and custom nuts. The rear suspension is pretty stock. I did change the geometry of that bell crank for the shock. Basically by lengthening this lever arm, I gave it stiffer suspension. That I'm running. My favorite shocks that I run on my cars are my speedrun cars are these Rolarlo shocks that came with the AK917. So I put these on all of my speedrun cars now. I don't think I have them on the CC01, but I have them on all my other. I think I got them on the TT02. I got them on the MF01X. I've got them on my Grasshopper, and now I've got them on this guy. So they're relatively inexpensive. I think they're like $20 for a pair. They're very stiff. They're short. They're durable. They're kind of not. I don't know if they're classified as a big bore, but they're fairly large in diameter, and they work, and they're cheap, and they're better than the other cheap shocks that you get. They don't leak, so I like them. I would highly recommend them to anyone doing speedrun cars. One of the things I did want to do was, because I wasn't quite sure on my ride height. The chassis is kind of weird in that it's straight back here and then it kind of kicks up a little bit in the front. Because of that, I wasn't quite sure where I wanted my rear end to be on the ride height. So I want to make sure I could adjust ride height, and I do that by adjusting the link that the shock mounts to on the chassis. So you can see this link here is actually adjustable. There's a hole pattern here, and I can take out these two screws and I can slide that in and out to adjust my height of the rear wheels. So it's kind of a cool little feature that I added to the design to make for quick adjustments. And I basically shoved those shocks up as high as possible, basically trying to lengthen that lever arm as much as possible to allow for that. There's like so many different points that we're picking up the original ORV chassis. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 points of picking up the original ORV chassis. It's kind of convenient that almost all these points are in the same plane, so using a flat plate to grab them all works out quite well. We did it on both sides. So that kind of brings us up to the front of the vehicle. We've seen crashes on the front now where people are cracking. They're crashing at relatively low speeds, and they're basically cracking or shearing off the front end of their chassis. So I knew from those experiences, I wanted to reinforce the front chassis as much as possible. As we've seen in other people's videos and pictures, the chassis typically fail here because there really isn't any reinforcement to speak of. This thing on the bottom doesn't do much for reinforcement. So I wanted to reinforce the chassis. From the top, it's really hard to reinforce that upper section because there's just no way to really tie that together. But I did try to reinforce behind it by putting this oversized carbon fiber plate. This plate has multiple functions. Not only is it a servo mount, but it also helps clip in the front end of the battery. So that battery slides in like so, and it actually tucks under that plate and pushes down, so the front end is captured, and we have that crossbar that captures the battery as well. All right, so on the steering servo, my favorite servos, and this is based on testing 20 different servos on the bench, looking at precision and deadband, and just general speed and torque, are these AGFRCs, 15 kilograms. So the model is a B44BLS servo, but these are kind of the best bang for the buck. They go for about $55, and so I've been using these on almost all of my speedrun cars. So most of my Tamiya speedrun cars require this double ball servo arm, because you got your steering linkages coming directly off the servo arm instead of going to bell cranks. I guess the exception is probably the TT02 on that. And there's not really, I don't think there's a lot of aluminum. There probably is, I just didn't look for it. But I've got these nice red aluminum servo arms that are single. It's a single ball servo arm. I like these because they clamp on the output shaft of the servo. So they're slop free, and they're unlikely to come loose over time. And then I make this carbon fiber adapter to go to the two balls that bolts onto that. You have to trim the aluminum arm down, but it's a pretty trick setup that's worked quite well for me. And it's also adjustable in length. You can see there's a slot there. So I can adjust that length if needed. And then we can see that I am obviously using conventional turnbuckles with these. I think these are like the Tamiya precision rod ends. I don't remember. The stock front suspension has a ton of slop. Even the aftermarket stuff is sloppy, and I just couldn't live with that. That's one of the things I do in all of my speedrun cars is get rid of the slop in the steering. So there's essentially zero slop in both the suspension, and I try to get zero slop out of the steering to the point where I will actually put glue in my rod ends to fill that small gap, and then I go back and exercise it, and usually that glue will debond from either the plastic or the metal, so you can get your steering back, and that basically becomes a zero slop setup. But it does make for a relatively stiff steering setup. So sometimes you got, it doesn't necessarily return to zero perfectly. And because it's stiff, it also can hamper your gyro if you're using a gyro. And lately with the gyros, I've actually been turning them almost completely off. This car, the steering is a little looser. I didn't do that trick. And so my steering is fast and it returns pretty easily. And so I have a little bit more gyro on this car than I do normally. I don't think it's really necessary, but I haven't optimized that setting. I just kind of set it and forget it. On the suspension linkages, so this is kind of a double wishbone suspension setup. I made a small adjustment to the upper link to give it, to basically correct the camber, to get zero camber, because originally it has a little bit of negative camber, and I usually run zero camber. And then I basically just sized these appropriately, and after printing the parts I went back and reamed out the holes for the pivots and lapped or sanded the thickness of these arms so it was a perfect fit. That's the other thing, is because there's so much slop in the pivots and everything, I actually drilled out the pivots on these chassis uprights as well as these aftermarket uprights, and then I machined custom hinge pins that were basically a zero clearance or a very small clearance pin to get rid of all that slop as well. So there's no wiggle in my suspension, and the 3D printed parts are holding up well, and it's also kind of a crush zone. If I were to crash, I would expect those arms to break versus something else that I didn't want to break, like the chassis. And then I integrated a custom shock tower into the design. And I designed that basically, once I got the suspension, the arms set up, I figured out what my ride height would be, and then I designed that shock tower. I also made sure I could pass the nose of the body through that opening. And I think the shock tower also helps kind of tie together the front two halves of the suspension to further reinforce or stiffen up that front end. And then if we flip the car over on the bottom, we can see that I've added a significant chassis plate to the bottom, which does most of the work of tying this whole thing together and reinforcing the front end. So if we do see impact forces on these wheels or the front arms, this plate will help reinforce that chassis so that it doesn't break. In principle, I have yet to test that. But I was kind of shooting from the hip, doing what I thought would be best, and we will have to see when we actually crash the car. Knock on wood, we have not crashed yet. And that leads us into the front bumper, which I think is probably one of the trickiest parts on the front end of the car because of how I integrated it. In order to show that, I'm going to take it apart just to kind of illustrate what all. It's a pretty complicated part, the bumper, because there's a lot going on with it. So the lower shocks actually screw into the hinge pin. So I have to, it takes two drivers to undo that. The out of time badge, if you haven't figured it out yet, is a homage to the Back to the Future DeLorean. That was the license plate on that car. I didn't know that before this. I actually had to look it up, and then I found out what it was, and I made it this badge. But this is actually a retaining clip for the bumper. So the bumper is printed in TPU. I wanted something that would absorb impact and not break. So TPU is a very resilient material, and this, you know, you can sit there and this is very squishy and foldy, but it has enough structure to it to act as a wing, and then it supports these vertical stabilizers in the front. I don't know how much these do. They do it on the F1 cars. I kind of did it for looks. I could probably change the shape a little bit to kind of match the profile. I don't know. It was just for fun. I thought it was kind of a cool little feature to add. I don't know how effective it is. At some point, the car gets a little goofy looking. Like, I've got these posts sticking out, which are for the original battery clips, and I thought it would be cool to put little badges there, like go fast or lightning bolts. I don't know. I actually ran out of time for the runs. But it's free real estate to put something cosmetic. Okay, so we've disconnected our shocks. This car has this bumper piece here, this bracket in the front, and everything kind of ties into that. So this clip is screwed through that piece with these 3 screws here. We'll go ahead and take those off. We'll let those screws fall out on their own. So this bumper just kind of slides right off, like so. And then this is that retention clip. Because the bumper is TPU, the retention clip is PLA. So there's the bumper with the carbon fiber end caps on. There's the retention clip. That guy falls into those holes there. There's tapped holes, or not really tapped, there's holes, blind holes in the bottom that we screw into. And we basically come up through the bottom, through that plastic piece. And then that also ties into the carbon fiber plate in front. And then there's a nice cutout at the bottom of this for all those different features. So that slides on like that, and then the carbon fiber sits flush with the bottom of that bumper. So that's kind of what the bottom of the car looks like. So yeah, people are breaking their steering knuckles, and that's because they're running the original frog steering knuckles, which, as we know, as everyone knows at this point, are not very strong because the axles are just pressed into a piece of cast aluminum. There's nothing retaining that axle, and so all it takes is a little bit of wiggle for it to come out. So I wanted a bomb-proof front end, and it doesn't take much. It's basically just a Blackfoot or Monster Beetle steering setup where you have your axle, your kingpin, which is the pin, the vertical pin here, goes through your axle, so that pin retains that axle. One of the things I don't like when you buy a lot of these aftermarket suspension kits is they use the screws as pivots, and screws are typically undersized. Like a 4mm screw might be like 3.95 millimeters in diameter. So you get a lot of slop by using screws as pivots. So I've replaced all my screws with pins, actual pins. So because I am using a actual pin here for my kingpin, I drilled and tapped the back side of my axle here, and I'm securing that kingpin with a grub screw. And then let's go ahead and pull out one of our hinge pins just to kind of look at that. They're pretty simple. So it's basically a pin that's tapped on both sides, and then I use these button head screws, these M3 screws, to secure them so they don't fall out. So one thing I should also mention is toe in versus toe out. Everyone has their own philosophies. I have mine, you have yours, and whatever works for you is what you should use. For me, I'm a toe in guy. That's kind of what I grew up doing on all my cars, toe in. And usually it's 1 degree, 1.5 degree. But a lot of people like toe out, and that's fine. So last year I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about with toe in versus toe out. So on my Grasshopper, I tried toe out and I tried toe in. I didn't really see a big difference between the two. And actually what I ended up settling on was running zero toe, which means that you have minimal scrub in theory, and it worked for me. And so that's what I ran because I didn't really see a difference. So I want to show one of the quirks about the front suspension on this car, which might be causing challenges for people. But this car, because it has those super short arms, has a lot of bump steer. In order to have like good geometry and not have bump steer, you're like all the pivot points on the outside should line up and all the pivot points on the inside should line up. They should be along the same line. As you can see, you've got really long steering linkages and really short suspension linkages. And so what that means is you got really bad bump steer. Bump steer basically means as you compress the suspension, you get induced steering. And you can see how the wheels want to toe in when we compress the suspension. And there's not a lot you can do to fix that, short of completely redesigning the suspension. So what you can do to mitigate that is to not have any suspension travel, or have super stiff suspension travel so it's not moving on you. I think it's necessary. I mean, you don't really need a lot of suspension. I don't think my shocks are going to use it all. If I compress this, you can kind of see that my wheels are actually doing quite a bit of compression, probably equal to or greater than my shocks. So I think my wheels are acting like natural shock absorbers, which obviously don't cause bump steer. At the end of the day, the setup works for me, and I don't think my suspension, as cool as it may look, I don't think it's actually doing much. What's helping me is that it's stiff, and I'm running these kind of balloon tires. I think that's what I have going for me. So one other thing I wanted to show before we kind of cut out the video is my bucket of parts. Every year I generate a bucket of parts. These are my trials and errors to get to where I am. These aren't even failed prints. These are successful prints that just the designs weren't right and I had to tweak them. So it takes a lot of, even though I'm using CAD, there's still a lot of trial and error to get it right. Different iterations of these guys, different iterations of these guys. Here's my first go at a bumper. Here's my first servo tray that wasn't quite right. Took me a while to get these plates right. I was playing around with how to print them, different colors. Wheel hubs, it took me a couple tries to get those right. So yeah, it's not, it's a lot of work to do these cars, as you know, if you're doing out open class and doing one of your crazy builds. I appreciate the work that goes into it, because I'm there. I like to do a lot of parts out of PLA before I do the full-blown carbon fiber, just to make sure things are right before I go and waste my carbon fiber material. So you'll find a lot of the parts that are carbon fiber were first printed in PLA just to make sure everything fit okay. And that is about it. It's a long video, but hopefully you found something useful in it. Good luck to all the speedrunners out there. It's the beginning of the competition. We got 3 weeks left to go. I think there's a lot of cool builds. It's fun. It's great to see so many people in the open class this year. Actually, I think the spread is pretty even right now, where we've seen a lot of people shift from the brushless and brushed into open class and the stock class. So it's a well-rounded competition, and there's some cool stuff going on. So thanks for watching, and thanks for competing, and take care. Bye.